And we, the youth, should learn a lesson from this situation to unite to make integration a reality.
A continent that has been carved up, divided, and controlled by foreign powers for centuries suddenly hears words that could change everything. One leader steps forward with a declaration so bold, so revolutionary, that it sends shockwaves across 54 nations and makes global superpowers genuinely nervous. What if I told you that right now, at this very moment, there's a plan in motion that could transform Africa from a collection of struggling, divided nations into the world's next great superpower? What if everything you thought you knew about Africa's future was about to be completely rewritten by a single, audacious announcement? And we, the youth, should learn a lesson from this situation to unite, to make integration a reality. Ibrahim Traoré, Burkina Faso's young president, just made an announcement that stunned the world and left seasoned diplomats scrambling for answers. Standing before his people, flanked by soldiers who represent his meteoric rise to power, he didn't just speak about his small West African nation. He didn't focus on the usual political rhetoric about trade agreements or regional partnerships. Instead, he delivered a message that cut through decades of political noise like a razor-sharp sword. One government, one currency called Afro money, one passport for the entire continent of Africa. The silence that followed was absolutely deafening. Then, like a dam bursting under pressure, the crowd erupted in cheers that could be heard for miles. But this wasn't just about one speech in one country. Within hours, social media platforms across Africa exploded, with reactions ranging from pure disbelief to overwhelming excitement. Hashtags like United States of Africa and Afro money began trending from the bustling streets of Lagos to the highlands of Nairobi, from the townships of Johannesburg to the ancient markets of Cairo. But here's what makes this announcement fundamentally different from every other Pan-African speech we've heard over the decades. This isn't coming from just any leader. This is Ibrahim Traoré, the man who has already proven he's willing to break every rule in the global order when it comes to challenging Western dominance. Think about it. This is the same leader who looked French troops in the eye and told them to pack their bags and leave. The same president who boldly rejected loans from the IMF and World Bank, institutions that have kept African nations trapped in debt cycles for generations. The same visionary who forged the alliance of Sahel states with Mali and Guinea, creating a new security and economic partnership that operates completely outside Western influence and control. Unlike the countless African leaders who have paid eloquent lip service to continental unity while maintaining the comfortable status quo, Traoré has already demonstrated a remarkable track record of turning bold words into concrete action. Sources close to his administration reveal that teams are already working behind the scenes, studying the intricate logistics of continental integration. They're not just talking about unity in abstract terms, they're actively planning for it. How would an African passport actually function across 54 different nations with different systems? What would it realistically take to merge dozens of different currencies into a single, powerful Afro money? What governmental structure would a Central African authority need to effectively represent over 1.4 billion people? The urgency in Traoré's voice wasn't merely aspirational rhetoric designed to inspire hope. It was operational, practical, and immediate. And that sense of urgency is exactly what has diplomats in capitals around the world staying up late at night, frantically trying to understand what this could mean for the entire global balance of power. Yet the announcement has also created unprecedented tension across the continent. Diplomatic sources across Africa privately admit they were completely blindsided by the declaration. No pre-consultations, no careful diplomatic preparation, no gradual buildup to ease concerns. Just a bold, uncompromising vision for continental redesign, delivered with the confidence of a leader who has already proven he's not afraid to challenge anyone or anything. Several African presidents are reportedly expressing private concerns behind closed doors, especially those whose national economies remain tightly intertwined with former colonial powers, or whose political survival depends on maintaining strong relationships with Western allies. Western governments, already deeply frustrated by Traoré's systematic rejection of their policies and his complete dismissal of their military presence in the region now find themselves confronting something they've worked tirelessly for decades to prevent: the terrifying possibility of Africa speaking with one powerful, unified voice on the global stage. But perhaps the most telling and emotionally powerful reactions are coming from ordinary Africans themselves, particularly the continent's youth who represent its future. For them, this isn't just political rhetoric or diplomatic maneuvering. It's deeply personal and transformative. It's about finally tearing down the invisible walls that have separated families for generations, limited entrepreneurial dreams, and confined human potential within borders that were drawn by people who never had Africa's best interests at heart. Consider this stark and almost absurd reality that millions of Africans face every day. It's often significantly easier for an African citizen to obtain a visa to visit Paris, London, or New York than it is to visit a neighboring African country just a few hundred miles away. Currency instability has made simple trade between African nations unnecessarily complicated and prohibitively expensive. Regional integration has remained nothing more than a distant dream, while the continent's vast potential continues to be systematically undermined by artificial division and external manipulation. Suddenly, one courageous leader is standing up and saying that those barriers don't have to exist anymore. Not gradually over the next 50 years, not eventually when conditions are perfect, but right now, starting today. To understand why this resonates, examine colonial legacy. European powers drew African borders to divide resources and control populations, breaking apart ethnic groups and trade networks. After independence, arbitrary lines hardened into boundaries defended more than questioned. Africa inherited competing governments, working in isolation. Traoré's passionate call for a single African government represents much more than just a political proposal or administrative reform. It's a fundamental ideological rejection of that entire painful colonial legacy. It's a bold attempt to replace systematic division with organic unity, to build a governmental structure where crucial decisions about Africa's future are made collectively by Africans for Africans, rather than piecemeal by individual nations that are still heavily influenced by external powers with their own agendas. He envisions a powerful continental authority that would effectively oversee comprehensive defense strategies for the entire continent, manage Africa's abundant natural resources equitably across all regions, create ambitious continent-wide infrastructure development plans that connect rather than divide, and represent Africa on the global stage as one unified, powerful voice rather than 54 separate, often competing ones that can be easily manipulated or divided by external interests. This visionary concept isn't entirely without precedent in African political thought and history. In the optimistic 1960s, Ghana's legendary leader Kwame Nkrumah famously proposed an immediate political union of all African states, urgently warning that achieving political independence without simultaneous economic and security integration would inevitably leave the entire continent dangerously vulnerable to sophisticated neo-colonial control and continued exploitation. His prophetic words proved tragically accurate. In the decades that followed the initial wave of independence, Africa systematically became a contested battleground for global superpowers aggressively vying for influence and access to resources, while economic dependency on former colonial powers actually deepened rather than decreased, as many had hoped. But what makes Traoré's approach fundamentally different from past leaders whose inspiring calls for unity remained largely philosophical and theoretical is that he's building his comprehensive proposal on recent, concrete, practical steps that demonstrate real commitment to change. The Alliance of Sahel States isn't just a symbolic security agreement written on paper. It's a functioning, operational model of how African nations can effectively cooperate and make decisions independently of external Western influence. His firm rejection of traditional Western financial institutions isn't merely symbolic posturing. It's concrete proof that viable alternative economic strategies and partnerships are not only possible, but can be successfully implemented. These tangible actions give his sweeping continental vision a sense of practical realism and immediate feasibility that his visionary predecessors often lacked. However, this ambitious vision also raises incredibly complex questions that cannot be answered simply with enthusiasm and good intentions alone. How would such a unified government actually function in practice when Africa's diverse nations vary so dramatically in their political systems, economic structures, and cultural approaches? We're talking about somehow integrating established democracies with traditional monarchies, military-led transitional governments with stable parliamentary systems, centralized republics with federal structures. Would there be a single African president elected through a continent-wide democratic process? Would leadership rotate among different regions to ensure representation? Would existing national parliaments be dissolved entirely into one massive continental legislature? Or would there need to be multiple layers of governance to manage such complexity? Most critically, how would national sovereignty be shared and balanced without accidentally reigniting the same dangerous ethnic, religious, and cultural rivalries that artificial colonial borders once deliberately exploited and that continue to create tensions in various regions today? These concerns aren't merely abstract academic debates. Countries with relatively strong, stable economies like Nigeria, South Africa, or Kenya might naturally resist the idea of contributing significant portions of their national budgets to a pooled continental fund designed to support economically weaker states, especially if domestic political pressures make such generosity unpopular with their own citizens. Meanwhile, nations with more fragile political institutions or smaller economies might understandably fear being completely overshadowed or effectively controlled by larger, more economically powerful governments that could dominate continental decision-making processes. Additionally, the sheer linguistic and cultural diversity presents massive practical implementation barriers that cannot be ignored. With well over 2,000 distinct languages spoken across the African continent, along with countless cultural traditions, legal systems, and administrative approaches, integrating complex governmental systems across such incredible diversity represents an absolutely unprecedented challenge in the entire history of human political organization. Still, the powerful momentum behind this transformative idea lies in a simple but undeniable truth that resonates with millions of ordinary Africans. People across the continent are growing increasingly tired and frustrated with operating within artificial boundaries that systematically limit their collective potential and keep them divided when they could be united. Traoré consistently argues that Africa already possesses all the essential ingredients needed to become a genuine global superpower, abundant natural resources that could power the world, the youngest and most dynamic population on Earth, with incredible energy and creativity, strategic geographic positioning that connects multiple continents, and vast untapped economic potential that remains largely unrealized. What the continent critically lacks, he passionately contends, is the centralized political authority and unified decision-making structure needed to effectively harness these tremendous advantages and present them as coordinated strength, rather than fragmented competing opportunities that can be easily exploited by external powers. If the concept of a single African government represents the beating political heart of Traoré's revolutionary vision, then his proposed Afro money serves as the essential economic lifeline that could make continental integration not just possible, but sustainable and powerful. Throughout history, currency has always represented much more than simply a convenient medium of exchange between buyers and sellers. It serves as a potent symbol of true sovereignty, a clear marker of genuine independence, and a crucial tool of economic and political power that determines how nations interact with the global economy. But tragically, throughout modern African history, currency has primarily functioned as an invisible chain of economic dependence that has kept the entire continent systematically tethered to its former colonial masters and prevented true economic liberation. Many African nations continue to use currencies that are directly and explicitly controlled by their former colonial powers, creating a situation where crucial monetary decisions affecting millions of African lives are made in European capitals rather than African ones. The CFA franc, which is currently used by 14 different African countries across West and Central Africa, remains pegged to the euro and is ultimately controlled by the French Treasury in Paris, meaning that French government officials have significantly more real influence over the monetary policies of countries like Senegal, Côte d'Ivoire, and Cameroon than those countries' own democratically elected governments do. Even in African nations that operate outside the restrictive CFA zone, continental trade and economic development remain heavily and problematically reliant on external currencies like the US dollar and the euro, creating dangerous vulnerabilities every time global financial markets fluctuate or external powers change their economic policies for their own domestic reasons. When the Federal Reserve in Washington decides to raise interest rates to combat American inflation, African economies thousands of miles away immediately feel negative impacts. When the powerful European Central Bank shifts its monetary policies to address European concerns, African businesses and consumers struggle with consequences they had no voice in creating. Traoré's bold concept of introducing Afro money represents much more than just financial convenience or administrative efficiency. It's a powerful declaration of comprehensive economic independence from external financial systems that have systematically kept Africa in a subordinate, dependent position for generations since independence. By establishing a single, continent-controlled African currency, he envisions nothing less than an economic revolution where vibrant intra-African trade would flourish and expand without the constant drag of unpredictable exchange rate instability, expensive currency conversion costs, or continued dependence on foreign banking systems that are controlled by institutions that have never prioritized genuine African development or prosperity. The current statistical reality of African trade patterns is both shocking and deeply disappointing. Despite being extraordinarily resource-rich with everything from precious metals to agricultural products to energy resources, only approximately 17% of Africa's total international trade actually happens between African countries themselves. To put this in perspective, compare that pathetic figure to Europe, where mutually beneficial intra-regional trade accounts for well over 60% of total trade volume, or dynamic Asia, where the figure consistently exceeds 50% and continues growing. The primary reasons for Africa's tragically low internal trade numbers include prohibitively high transaction costs, completely unpredictable currency fluctuations that make business planning nearly impossible, and unnecessarily complex border restrictions that have historically made it significantly easier and more profitable for African nations to conduct trade with distant European or Asian partners than with their immediate neighbors who share similar challenges and opportunities. A properly implemented shared continental currency could dramatically reduce these artificial costs and barriers, creating a unified market large enough and powerful enough to rival established economic giants like China or the European Union in terms of purchasing power and economic influence. The vision of unified Africa faces enormous practical challenges that cannot be dismissed with optimism alone. Creating a successful single currency requires unprecedented economic convergence, coordinated fiscal policies, harmonized inflation rates, common banking regulations, and extraordinary mutual trust among competing nations. Europe's Euro experience provides both inspiration and cautionary lessons. It required decades of preparation, massive investment, and continuous compromise among countries with similar development levels and democratic systems. Even then, the Eurozone faced multiple crises when policies diverged or external shocks affected members differently. Governance questions remain complex. Who would control the new Afro money system? Where would an African central bank be headquartered? How would countries handle lost monetary sovereignty, particularly those using exchange rates to manage economic shocks? Despite these hurdles, enthusiasm grows rapidly, especially among Africa's youth. Young entrepreneurs see unified currency as opportunity to create continent-wide businesses without currency barriers and conversion costs. Traders envision reduced transaction costs and simplified cross-border operations. The cultural significance has captured imaginations. Online campaigns circulate prototype Afro money designs, featuring African heroes like Sankara, Nkrumah, and Lumumba instead of colonial figures, representing powerful reimagining of African identity. Traoré's unified African passport addresses freedom of movement restrictions. Currently, Africans find it easier traveling to Europe or Middle East than neighboring African countries due to costly visas, complex applications, arbitrary restrictions, and colonial-era immigration policies. The absurd reality, a Ghanaian entrepreneur traveling to Rwanda might route through Dubai because direct African flights are limited and visa requirements make indirect routes through non-African countries more practical. A Senegalese student might find studying in France easier than Tanzania, despite cultural and economic benefits of staying in Africa. The unified passport would grant unrestricted access to all 54 countries, allowing Africans to live, work, study, and conduct business wherever opportunity calls, converting Africa from isolated territories into an interconnected continental homeland. Economic implications would be transformative. Continental labor markets would allow skilled professionals to relocate where talents are needed, potentially reversing devastating brain drain. Agricultural workers could follow crop cycles across climatic zones, increasing productivity and food security. Entrepreneurs could establish multi-country businesses without bureaucratic nightmares. Tourism could finally flourish as Africans freely explore their continent's diversity. Vision faces obstacles. Political leaders must surrender sovereignty. Economic disparity between Nigeria's massive economy and smaller states needs unprecedented solidarity. Security challenges from insurgencies require baseline stability. External powers invested in individual relationships would see unified Africa altering global balance, yet momentum builds. Youth urgently drive conversations, seeing unity as practical necessity. Continental Free Trade Area demonstrates integration possibility. Technology provides tools through digital payments and mobile networks. The question isn't whether obstacles exist, but whether Africa reached a turning point where division costs outweigh unity. Challenges. Whether Traoré's United States of Africa remains speech or becomes foundation depends on upcoming choices. The conversation has shifted fundamentally and won't return to old assumptions. Transformation seeds are planted. For the first time in decades, choices feel consequential, and unified Africa feels closer than ever.